Good morning again. As you're finishing your breakfast, I see Mr. Burse. I see he's ending up his breakfast. Yeah. You're first on program, so we're going to ask you to come to the platform. And we'll begin our plenary session.
Good morning. I'll be singing for you today This Bildnis ist bezaubernd schön, which is from the Magic Flute by Mozart. And basic storyline is the queen sent me to rescue her daughter, and I see this picture of her daughter, and she's beautiful, so I'm charged to go and rescue her.
Dies Bildnis ist bezaubert schön, wie noch keiner gejegelt sein. Ich fühle es, wie dies Götterbild mein Herz mit neuer Regung füllt. Mein Herz mit neuer Regung füllt. Dies etwas kann nicht wann ist hin, doch fühl ich wie Feuer brennen. Soll die Entfernung Liebe sein, soll die Entfernung Liebe sein. Ja, ja, die Liebe ist allein. Die Liebe ist allein. Oh, wenn ich sie noch wenden könnte, oh, wenn sie doch schon vor mir stände, ich werde warm und rein, was werde ich? Ich werde sie voll entzücken, an diesen heißen Busen drücken, und ewig wäre sie dann mein, und ewig wäre sie dann mein, und ewig wäre sie dann mein, ewig wäre sie dann mein, ewig wäre sie dann mein.
Thank you, Mr. Burse. Thank you, Dr. Michael Bates, Interim Chair, Department of Music. Wonderful. Dr. Benjamin, Planning Committee, colleagues. All around us, excitement is in the air as we are well into our second day of exploring problem-based learning. On yesterday, we were fortunate to hear and see several approaches to problem-based learning. This morning, our speaker will share with us yet another approach. It is my privilege to introduce our keynote speaker, who is the Manager of Strategic Initiatives for Apple Computer Incorporated in Austin, Texas. He's also Vice President for Product and Business Development at Articulearn Incorporated. Correction, he was Vice President. The person of whom I speak received his PhD in General Studies Administration with an emphasis in computer science and educational research and statistics from the University of Missouri at Columbia. He also received his Master of Arts and his Bachelor of Science degrees from the University of Missouri, Columbia. Our speaker has taught in the College of Education at the University of Texas at Austin, the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, the University of Missouri at Kansas City, the University of Missouri, Columbia, in the area of instructional leadership and technology. He was also a teacher at Lee's Summit High School in Kansas City, Missouri. Our speaker has served as Executive Director of Technology Services for the Austin Independent School District and Director of Technology for the Independent Missouri School District. As Apple's Strategic Initiatives Manager, our speaker is responsible for efforts in this field, including working with state and national leaders on educational policy, working with schools and universities on research and development opportunities, and facilitating strategic planning for the successful implementation of 21st century learning environments. His work has included planning and implementation of numerous statewide learning and teaching initiatives and leverage technology. He works with state leaders on the creation and funding of technology allotments for schools. He conducts research on collaborative online learning environments and develops strategic plans for state, universities, and school districts nationally. Our speaker this morning served as the worldwide manager for online learning at Apple. His work has included the creation of the Apple Learning Interchange, the Professional Development Online Learning System, and QuickTime TV for Learning. Now, Dr. Tom Burnett informed me that I could make up stories if I wanted to, as I was thinking of what I would say to introduce him. But as you can see, there was no need to make up any stories. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in a high-spirited UAPB welcome for Dr. Tom Burnett.
Thank you so much. That was too nice. A couple of observations. I can't help it. I taught mathematics at Lee Summit High School, and maybe I need to move this lower. I can almost hear myself being way too loud. And I like to wander around, so thank you for Richard, wherever you are, for the lavalier mic to let me do that. That way, if you're sitting in the back row, you really can't escape me. You can sit there, but you can't escape me. But a couple of things came to mind during that introduction, and thank you. That was really nice. One, I feel at home. You noticed I did a little work at the University of Missouri at Columbia, so I appreciate you putting out all the black and gold napkins to welcome me today. Really, really appreciate that. And the second piece is I heard that, I was reminded of something. Since 1980, so we're now at 32 years, every degree program and every career job that I've had didn't have an incumbent before I got there. For 32 years, the jobs I've walked into and the degree programs I've walked into didn't exist before I had the pleasure of walking into them. That's a blessing and a curse. The blessing is you kind of get to write your own job description. The curse is you better be good once you get there or you get thrown out pretty quick. But I had to laugh at the introduction because before my mother, excuse me, I've got some water up there in a minute I may have to grab. Before my mother and father passed, they had the chance to come down after I joined Apple and heard me do a presentation to a group like this and had a wonderful introduction like that. And I was talking about how I was actually living this reality of how many jobs you have in your lifetime, right? And how many of those things can be in the current age. To which my father, so my mother is glowing proud, right? To which my father replied, "Marie, the kid can't hold a damn job." Oh, thank you. And the reality was, my father left school at the end of 8th grade. Grew up in a little bitty town called Lexington, Missouri, little Missouri River town. And my father left school at the end of the 8th grade. He had one employer his entire life, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. He left the Army Corps of Engineers at the end of his career. He had responsibility for the Missouri River from Missouri City, Missouri, to Miami, Missouri. Now, Miami, Missouri is a spot. I don't think there's a town even there left at Miami, Missouri, but there was a river gauge there. So he had responsibility for the river when he retired from those two areas. And so for him, the concept of all this change was just totally foreign, absolutely foreign. So again, thank you for that. What I'd like to do today is give you a glimpse into some things that how personally I think, how Apple as a company thinks about learning, share with you some key trends, talk with you about some research we've been doing, and probably tell a few more stories along the way if that sounds good. I'm going to do my best to stop about 10 minutes early so that if you have any questions, we'll have a chance to do that. Sound good? All right. So I fundamentally believe we're at this point. You're at a fork in the road. And you've got big decisions to make. And we're going to talk about what some of those decisions are and how they flow through. But first, we're going to start with a poll. So does everybody have a cell phone or sit next to somebody that has a cell phone? If you do, get them out. Because we're going to do a little poll right now about perceptions. And this is our first poll. You can see it up on the screen. You'll text to 37607. By the way, we're going to have more questions as the morning goes on. So you'll text to 37607. Words have meaning. I was a math teacher, but I appreciate English. Words have meaning. And the question is this: over the past 100 years, how much have public perceptions changed regarding what goes on in a classroom? If you think they've changed a lot, to 37607, text 348167. If you think they've changed some, text 348168. If you think they've changed a little, 348169, and none at all, 348170. Okay, we know it's working. I'll give you a minute. Over the past 100 years, how much have public perceptions changed regarding what goes on in a classroom? If you haven't mastered texting, I'm looking around the room. There's some very young people in this room that will be glad to come to your table and help you out. By the way, if you don't have your cell phone with you, you can borrow one of the person next to you. I've got this set up so every phone can actually submit 3 messages. That way, if you didn't bring your cell phone, you'll be able to grab it and participate. This is a tool called Poll Everywhere. Some of you may use Poll Everywhere. It's free for up to 40 users. So for most educators in a classroom, it works pretty well in a free mode. A lot of schools go ahead and buy a school-wide license, however, because it gives you access to build even more intricate questions with better graphics and animations and things you can put in your questions. Most of the ones that we have here are just going to be very simple questions like this. And when I say it's free, it will stop at 40, but I'm going to go ahead and stop now. So let's if you're still texting, please do. But we've got kind of 2 nodes that are sticking out more than the rest, although some is right there. Not at all is way low, but almost 40% of you say a lot. About a third of you say a little. But if we said some or a lot, we're at what? So I'll get my math skills out here. 61% of you at this point? down to 60%. So I want to share a couple of slides with you, and then we're going to take this poll again. As a matter of fact, I'm going to go back in as we look at that and go back to this perceptions poll because I want to show you some pictures from that time frame. And look at them, okay? Here's a classroom in 1925. Here's 1962. I was in school in 1962. Here's a classroom in 1998. This actually looked a lot like the classroom I taught high school mathematics in at Lee Summit, Missouri, Lee Summit High School. I didn't have a television in the corner, but I did have an overhead projector. So yes, I was one of those math teachers that by the time May rolled around, this part of my hand was black and green and red and blue. And about the time school started back up in August, I'd gotten it off. And then it started again. So that was my classroom. And then I'm not really trying to pick on this company, but there's a message in these slides. Because if you'll notice in all of those slides, there were rows and columns of students. There was a clear front of the classroom. And in this case, I have a teacher standing in front of that group of students who are patiently looking at what that teacher's doing. I was told not to do that and get close. And just because the technology is new, not a lot has actually changed. And if that wasn't bad enough, have you had funding crises here in Arkansas? Always. So most of the states around the country, and I have a chance to travel those states, have experienced those funding crises. And so in the past legislative session, there were some huge cuts that happened in most states. Arkansas was actually a lucky state, is my understanding. But I want to show you, if the internet willing, a cartoon. This is just this past year. That if funds were going to be cut, obviously this is what education looks like. Right? How many will this arena hold? And how many students here?
32.
32. So you could bring your whole student body in here for introduction to biology and just teach them right here. As a matter of fact, why did you build all the buildings? Let's just put them all right here in the gymnasium and let's have classes one after another after another. Could have saved a lot of money. That's what we're going to do when we cut funds. All right, so given, and by the way, that's perception. So I go back let me kill that window off and go back to the presentation here and ask you to get your cell phone back out again. And I'm going to clear the results because that's an option I have. And given what I just showed you, let me ask you again, over the past 100 years, how much have public perceptions changed regarding what goes on in the classroom? Same question, same code. You don't have to enter that 37607 again. Let me blow it up so that it's bigger for you. So our results are coming in a little different. And I staged that, obviously. But I wanted to make a point. And by the way, the key word in this sentence, because I'll argue they've changed a lot in many classrooms, maybe not in most classrooms, but in many. The key word is perceptions. Because the perception truly is, if we cut funding to education, we're going to have to hold classes in the football stadium. Because the public perception is that's what teachers do. They lecture to students. Whether we want to gain that or not, that's public perception. That's why that cartoon was written in that way. Because that was the conversation, right? Oh, we're going to have to increase the number of students per teacher. We had a floor of 22 to 1 and no more. Now we're going to have to let it go to 30 to 1 or 40 to 1 at the high schools or 50 to 1 at the high schools. So it's a perception issue along the way. Very good. So as we talk about this concept of project-based learning, we have to remember there's a reality that sits out there of perception. So let me talk about 3 key words that I think are fueling opportunity for you. One is innovation. Alan Kay is a very noted futurist and scientist. He was on the original team that developed the graphical user interface at Xerox PARC, Xerox Palo Alto Research Center. Apple didn't invent the graphical user interface. Xerox just didn't know what it had, and Steve Jobs saw it and did know what they had, and bought it. This is one of the key quotes. There's a couple others I want to share with you. Technology is anything that wasn't around when you were born. Technology is anything that wasn't around when you were born. How many of you were born before there were cars? Okay, we're good. When you get in the car today, do you get in and go, oh, technology? What do I do? What's this pedal going to do if I touch it? What happens if I push this button? None of that happens, right? Because it was around when you were born. You grow up with it. For those of you of my generation in the room, what happened the first time someone put a computer in front of you? Oh, what if I do this? What's the worst that can happen? But do you remember that moment? Do you remember that moment when you go, can I hurt it? Where does the file go? I mean, I had to love I tell family stories. I had to love my mother. She got into genealogy research, and she had I bought her a computer so we could do email together. I brought her a computer so we could do email together. And so she decided she was going to create the family genealogy piece. So she had the pictures, she had all the research. When I went to look at her files, you have to understand that she was 82 when she was doing that at the time. When I went to look at her files, she had created a page and saved it as a Word document for every page in the genealogy research. Couldn't comprehend how pages would flow over and grow into one document, even though I told her over and over and over, you really don't need to do that, Mom. And she fretted over every page when she had to change something, because that meant she had to change everything else and go back through. So we had that experience along the way, right? So technology is anything that wasn't around when you were born. This one's a good one from Apple's perspective because it kind of falls into the guidelines of some of the things we've been doing lately. Best way to predict the future is actually to invent it. Daniel Pink in a lot of his presentations and a lot of the work that he's done, has a great conversation about and asks the questions of audiences. How many of you knew you needed an iPod in the year 2000? You knew you had to have an iPod. If someone, come on Sony, you had a Walkman, when are you going to get that iPod thing? How many of you knew you needed to have that? Yet all of a sudden that came out, changed the way we view music today. So the best way to predict the future is to invent it. And my favorite, because I do it more often than not, and that's because what? We learn from our, okay? So if we can set up structures where we can fail more quickly and more often, we'll learn more quickly and more often. That's our opportunity in this case. That's the opportunity that we have. Now, here's the critical juncture. This is my grandson. When I was his age, I would go to my Aunt Vernie's in Norburn, Missouri, and she had a crank phone. She lived out in the country. She had a crank phone, party line, the whole bit. Now, back in the metropolis of Lexington, Missouri, I had a party line. My family had a party line rotary phone. That was my baseline technology. That's what I thought of as technology, as the first remembrance of things that I had access to. This is my grandson. Imagine in his lifetime, because you can imagine in your own lifetime the changes. I want you to think about where your baseline was. Imagine the changes that will take place in his lifetime, in the students at this university's lifetime, in the students in the school's lifetime. For many of, how many have grandkids in this room? Whole new world having grandkids, right? In your grandkids' lifetimes. 3 R's. We started with these. By no way are they sufficient anymore. I'll add the 3 C's to those: communication, collaboration, and construction of knowledge. And then I'll add C and I. And for those of you in colleges of education, I'm not talking about curriculum and instruction. I'm talking about creativity and innovation. That if you're really going to be successful in this world today, you have to have all of those skills. You have to have all of those things going for you, otherwise you're at risk. I would argue that you're absolutely at risk in this world today. Reading, writing, and arithmetic get you somewhere, but not very far. So there's our 20th century model of education. We've got a curriculum, we've got an assessment that overcomes it. And here from the Partnership for 21st Century Schools is a broader view of the kinds of things we actually have to have if we're going to be successful. If you haven't looked at the Partnership for 21st Century Skills, I encourage you to Google it, Yahoo it, Bing it, however you get to it, and take a look at what they're doing. It's just absolutely incredible in describing the kind of world our students really need to be learning in and being assessed in. Disrupting Class. How many of you have read this book? If you haven't, I encourage you to get a copy of it. Author's name's Clayton Christensen, primary author. He's done research into innovations, and he's done this in business, in medicine, in economics, in politics, and he just recently, in the past few years, did it for education. And he talks about 2 types of innovations: sustaining innovations and disruptive innovations. When I showed you the whiteboard, the smart board, he would describe that as a sustaining innovation. And if you looked at the classroom, you could see it was a very sustaining innovation. Didn't really change what happened in the classroom, didn't fundamentally alter what's going on, but it did do something better than what was there before, which is chalk and a chalkboard, right? If nothing else, to get dust out of the way. But it's better. Disruptive innovation is something that actually disrupts what's going on. I used the conversation earlier about the iPod. The iPod was a disruptive innovation. He actually writes about it in the book. That was a disruptive innovation. It changed the music industry. It changed the way we purchased music. Changed the way we listened to music. It disrupted an entire industry. So he talks about those 2 kinds of innovations. And I would argue that as you think about this whole conversation around problem-based learning, that these technologies offer you the opportunity to accelerate it, but they don't do it on their own. Remember the smartboard. They don't do it just by themselves. They offer a great opportunity, but they're not sufficient in and of itself. The next word, blended. So innovation, blended. We're hearing a lot of conversations around blended or hybrid learning. Let me share with you a couple of quick videos. Tell you what, let's don't wait for that to finally get there. Let me share with you the second video because I actually have it on the computer. Talking about blended learning. This is from a suburb of Denver, Colorado.
The staffers at Woodland Park High School are getting attention worldwide for not giving out homework. Instead, students watch recorded lectures at home and then do the corresponding homework
now it
during
starts
regular
to play.
class time. 11 News reporter Rosie Blue.
Apologize. The system has failed you. I have failed you. I have failed to help you share your talent with the world when the world needs talent more than ever, yet it's being wasted every day by an educational system steeped in tradition and old ideas. Well, it's time for a new tradition. It's time to realize talent isn't just in schools like this one. It's everywhere. It's time to use technology to rewrite the rules of education. To learn how you learn so we can teach you better. It's time university adapted to you rather than you adapting to it. It's time for a different kind of university. It's your time.
I love that comment in the context of where we're sitting right now. For the university to adapt to you as opposed to you adapt to it. I know you're here because you believe that. I know you're here because you believe that. The K12 example, for the sake of time, I'm going to skip. What we're seeing is this huge growth of blended learning in both K through 12 education and higher education. So much so that at last year's Teacher of the Year Award at the White House, you can see the President, you can see the Secretary of Education. This was the winner, but up here, and I'll see if I can zero in on him, because I'll draw attention to him. It's a gentleman named Paul Anderson. He teaches science at a high school in Bozeman, Montana. He was one of the 4 finalists. And the message I was telling you, including the woman who actually won, is their classrooms are totally flipped. They don't give lectures in class anymore, at all. Their lectures are all online. If you want to see Paul Anderson's lectures, go to bozemanscience.com. All of his lectures for all of his classes are sitting there on the web, freely given to anybody who wants to watch them, at bozemanscience.com. The day I visited Paul's class, this problem was up on the board. The students walked in, they were asked to answer this problem. It's a good motion velocity problem. And his response after 5 minutes of having the students work on their answer to that problem was, the answer, by the way, is D, yes, excuse me, is E, yes, at some time during interval 3 to 4, if you were wondering. If I had time, I'd actually force you to do this problem as a good example. But his point was, in 5 minutes, by the answer to that question, and he put in really good detractors, he knew which students knew the content and which students didn't. And he was able to differentiate instruction on the fly in his classrooms. And those students who really understood it and knew the answer to the question went off, and what did they do? They started working on their projects. They were using logo tools and software to build cars, and they were racing them, and then they had to do an obstacle course, and then they had to do going over mountains and all kinds of different things. They went to a project problem-based learning approach. And he was taking care of all the other things relative to lectures and understanding of content, things like that, in this particular way. Like I said, I would normally actually cause you to have to take this poll, as he caused the students to, but we'll go on. By 2019, according to this book, Disrupting Class, over half of the courses taken in schools and universities are going to be taken online. Are going to be taken online. Then let's talk about learners for a second.
I went to college because I thought
College is the next level. As a digital native,
we're visual learners.
more demanding.
99% of the teachers do it the old-fashioned way of
Sit down, you listen to someone lecture for 40, 50 minutes.
Being in this lecture-based environment that a classroom is presents a problem because
Just lectures limits my learning.
I love that line, just lectures limits my learning. So the students are asking for this. It isn't like they're wanting to have things spoon-fed to them. They're not wanting to do that, as a matter of fact. We know this group of students is different. One of my favorite quotes, the former University of Missouri president, Elson Floyd, made this comment: culture eats strategy every day of the week. Culture eats strategy every day of the week. I want to give you a couple of quick examples. Back in 1968, I grew up in the Kansas City area, the Kansas City A's, not the Kansas City Royals. The Kansas City A's had left to go out west, and so there was one other team left in Missouri to cheer for, and that was the St. Louis Cardinals. And in 1968, the Cardinals, led by Bob Gibson, were in the World Series, playing the Detroit Tigers. And we were sitting in Coach Bob Mitchell's social studies class, and several of us were sitting there listening to his lecture, just enthralled by Coach Mitchell's lecture. You know, we would nod our heads every so often, because nodding your head always causes the instructor to think you're listening. So if you just nodded your head, you'd be fine. You had to cover up the earbud in your ear. And yeah, we had the radios in our pockets. We were listening to the World Series game. There was nothing Coach Mitchell was going to do to stop probably a dozen of us from listening to the World Series game. He caught on. He saw what we were doing, and he stopped and he said, "Let me make you a deal." He goes, "If I let you watch the World Series, will you let me teach you history from the standpoint of the cities of Detroit and St. Louis?" So we're going to study the music of the time, we're going to study the politics of the time, we're going to study the economics of the time, we're going to study all of the things, and we'll study them in the context of the two cities of Detroit and St. Louis. And Coach Mitchell was really smart, because he knew the amount of dead space between a pitch and a hit and a ball and a strike. He had ample time to teach. Now, you have to think of what I said, words have meaning. He would let us watch. He would not let us listen to the World Series. But we got to watch, and that was a great trade-off, and probably learned more about history in those few weeks of the 1968 World Series. It went 7 games, thank goodness, because we had a lot of learning to do during that time. Great opportunity. Culture eats strategy every day of the week. He embraced the culture rather than fighting it. Fast forward, my first year of teaching, a good friend of mine was a school principal at an elementary school outside of Kansas City on the Kansas side. Teacher came running into the classroom and said, "Ms. Jones, come outside to the playground. The kids are playing cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians, whatever. They had toy guns and they were shooting at one another." So think about toy guns in the context of the day and what would happen on any campus if that were to occur. So did what any principal would do. Said, "Can't have guns." Sent a note home to the family. Said, "Please don't have your sons, daughters bring guns to school." 2 days later, same teacher came into the principal's office. "Ms. Jones, you got to come to the playground and look." So Ms. Jones went out to the playground, and the kids were still playing cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians. Mainly the boys, of course. But the kids were still playing cowboys and Indians, cops and robbers, Wild Wild West, whatever piece we wanted to have in that context. and they were shooting each other with bananas. Come on, you're a kid, you had creativity, right? So, Ms. Jones, Catherine had a decision to make, had a fundamental decision to make. Do I ban fruit? Or do I have to deal with this in some other way? Because she realized if she banned fruit, she had an even bigger problem. She had to be prepared. If she banned fruit, she had to be prepared when the next student started doing this to cut off their fingers. If you were going to stop it, you had to be prepared to do that. The culture at that time was going to cause kids on playgrounds to play those games. If you could have figured out how to embrace that, you would have had learning go crazy. If you could have figured out how to embrace it instead of fighting it. So I want you to keep that in mind, because that also gives you fuel in this movement to more problem or project-based kinds of learning environments. It gives you great fuel to meet students where they are, rather than trying to pull them to where you want them to be. We've all seen the things like this. Viral learning is a huge concept. We see this happening all the time. Student-to-student kinds of learning. All student-to-student kinds of learning. I wasn't going to do this for time's sake because you're in the room. It's your fault. If I go over a minute, it's your fault. Not because you sang. I wish you'd sing more. But I want to show this example of viral learning. Here is something, if you type Canon into YouTube, this will come up in your top 5 hits. I want you to watch. Stop that. How many of you have watched that video before? One? Steve has, of course. Yep. So here's the interesting piece about this. YouTube stopped him. I'll highlight this. Here's how many people have viewed it since YouTube reset him. His number was at about 89 million views, and YouTube reset it because they didn't know what to do if he went over 100 million views of Fun 2. By the way, teenage South Korean sitting in his bedroom, pointed a camera at him and played Canon. And has had well over 100 million people view that video. Not only having viewed that video, learned to play Canon with their own instruments. A lot of guitars, obviously, but flutes, trumpets, violins, even drums, of all things. He built a learning community around what he did, and that learning community finally came back to him and said what most teachers never have said to them. Fun 2, we've mastered Canon. Can you give us something harder? When have you heard students come to you and say, thank you, can you give me something harder to do? Imagine in that environment. Viral learning. There's no teacher, there's no faculty member, just happening virally. And there's numerous examples of this occurring. Had another poll, but for the sake of time, the thing I want you to try and focus on as you think about this fundamental change that you're doing is a flip. We talk teaching and learning. We're talking about blended classrooms and flipping classrooms. I want you to flip these words and start to say learning and teaching. So learning is really the factor that we're trying to get to. And I think that's one of the problems that you have, is most people, when they say teaching and learning, really do believe that. Without teaching, there cannot possibly be learning. And when most people say teaching, we're absolutely constrained by our perceptions. And when most people say teaching, they are looking at it just like we are today. There's somebody with supposed expertise standing in the front of the room, and there's other people sitting watching the person with supposed expertise. Right? That's teaching, the perceptions poll. But if we flip it and talk about learning, it gives us flexibility. It gives us freedom to be able to talk about what's the best context for learning. It allows us to talk about culture eats strategy every day of the week and embed that into what we're trying to do in terms of learning. Imagine the students in Coach Mitchell's classroom that were freed up from, instead of listening to him lecture, he actually asked them to go off and do projects based around the music. If they were interested in music, they started studying Motown, they started studying the blues in St. Louis, and they started studying cultures from a different perspective than what they ever would have done learning history at that time. The same thing for the crazies like me that really wanted to deal with it from a sports perspective. I really thought that would be an interesting thing to see where the teams came from, where the names came from, who were the owners, how did they build up, where did the teams happen, and all of those kinds of questions of all the major sports teams in those two towns. Education is a noun. Learning is a verb. Verbs are important. They're active. They're engaged. They're involved. They're collaborative. They're communicative. This is me learning. I had a teacher. If I panicked, I got on that rotary dial phone and called a friend. That phone a friend thing on that show, whatever it was, Millionaire, was really important because that's what you did when you're in trouble. You phoned a friend. And then I was blessed. I was blessed because I had a set of encyclopedias. Now, I wasn't as blessed as you might think because I had a sister who was 7 years older than I was. So by the time they were to me, they were 7 years lost in that process. If I look at students today, their network of how they access information is radically different. Now, this is theirs, not necessarily yours that you think you're using in your classrooms, but this is their network of learning. We've done a few things, and I want to close with this, in terms of looking at these principles of innovation, of blended, and of looking at learners and the culture of those learners. To do some research in the past with the Apple Classrooms of Tomorrow. It's still the longest longitudinal research in the world into the impact of technology on students and how it affects teachers as well. We created a new piece called ACOT 2, which is an update of that research in the last 3 years. And then we created something called challenge-based learning. And I asked Steve, he said he mentioned it a couple of times, but I want to give you a quick thing before we conclude. And so we built this framework for challenge-based learning. And challenge-based learning, to me, this is Tom Burnett's interpretation for us, is really problem or project-based learning with a purpose. Students want relevance in what they do. They want to know what they're doing has importance. They want to share what they're doing with the world. And by the way, they have a platform on the World Wide Web to share it with the world. Fun too, sitting in his bedroom in South Korea has a worldwide platform. He's taught more students music than any music teacher on the planet. Guaranteed. He's taught more music to any teacher on the planet. It starts with big ideas. It moves to a set of essential questions and asks students to pose essential questions. And then the challenge becomes. But I don't know in the back if you can see these, but a challenge might be, if it's sustainability, what's the impact of my water consumption? How do I reduce my family or my school's water consumption? Or my city's water consumption? By the way, for most places around, water actually is a bigger issue than oil. Water and water rights are a bigger issue than oil and oil rights today. Climate change, reduce my use of fossil fuels. Health and wellness, get more flu vaccines for kids in my community. The economy, I thought this was interesting, an example. Increase the percent of students in your school that stay for one more year. Imagine if the students in the school had a problem about the economy, if we know what happens if students drop out, and the students in the school took responsibility as a project for changing that, to get one more student, because they know what that means from a purely economic perspective. Forget all of the other perspectives that are valuable enough to do that. So this is why I'm saying it's like a project, but it's a project from the student's perspective. It's not a pre-programmed project that the teacher decides, we're going to do problem-based learning, I'm going to pick your problem, and then I want you to form groups and go out and work on it. I mean, I make fun, that's still far better than the other. But the twist on it was, this problem needs to have relevance to you as a student. This problem needs to have meaning to you as the student. When you report out, you're not reporting back to your teacher, you're reporting back to your school, you're reporting back to your school board, you're reporting back to your community to change, to do something fundamentally that's going to change, because there's a problem. It really is a problem in this case. It's not a manufactured one, it's a real problem. And we want people to take the time to be able to address that particular problem. So how do we use water? We'll use the water example. Where does water come from? How much water is wasted? There's all kinds of questions that could be asked that can focus students' attention, and in the process of working that way, cause them to learn all the minuscule objectives that I know are going to be on the standardized tests, of course. But when you have people like Maynard New Tech High and others that are following in those models, we know that stuff takes care of itself. What's more important is getting that one more student. Changing values around water or sustainability or health in your community. 3 strategic directions, and I want to close, and we'll have about 5 minutes for questions that I'll ask you to take a look at. 1, there is this huge growth of digital content, and having repositories and being able to take advantage of that digital content is huge. The second is there's this huge growth in mobility and mobile platforms for learning. And by the way, when the industry talks about mobile platforms for learning, this is not considered mobile. This is mobile. Certainly this is mobile. They actually don't consider this as a mobile platform. So the move to mobility is to devices like these. And the final piece that's probably the most exciting and fits right in with the structure of what you're doing over these 2 days is what we would describe as almost free agent learning, personalized learning. Learning in a context that's mine as opposed to yours. Because I know if I can get into that kind of learning, it erupts, and change occurs, and learning flourishes. I'll stop. I think I've got 5 minutes, 2 minutes, 3 minutes. I apologize. Questions? Yes?
Mm-hmm. And
Bozeman, Montana.
Like how we would put lectures online.
Yep.
My concern, which ties into your strategic directions as well, is the economic divide that can easily occur based on a home's economic resources to provide these kinds of technologies in a home. So I'm concerned that we are creating a class divide in terms of who has the economic means to purchase these devices on their own. And so I'm just wondering if the thinking from Apple or in terms of social justice,
right.
how do we meet that divide? Because I see it in my classroom in terms of who has access to technology in the home, and especially in K12. And I'm just wondering if you're thinking through those problems.
Absolutely are, and let me give you my spin on it. There are poor school districts around the nation who have taken that problem and said it's an important problem and have provided a device for every single student. Cultural imperative. Absolute cultural imperative. It is not. Now I'll be bold enough to say it is not a money issue. It is a cultural imperative issue. It's not a money issue. I'm in McAllen, Texas. McAllen, Texas has 26,000 students, 98-point-something% Hispanic, 69% poverty. Those students would never have those devices. Every one of those students by Christmas will have an iPad. Every single one of those students would have an iPad. McAllen isn't wealthy. There's no oil in the backyard. None of those things occur. The superintendent, the community just said it's an imperative for us to do that. What you're describing isn't a money issue, it's a leadership issue. Schools have figured out how to do that. Let me tell you my concern over a divide is not in having the technology, but it's the focus of this conference, is what they're doing with the technology. Because I can take you to many districts where they've put whiteboards in every classroom, they've got a set of laptops sitting there, and they're still doing education like it's 1912. Nothing has changed. So the access wasn't the issue, it's what they're doing with the technology. As you look at divides, look at that one. That one concerns me far more, because I've seen leaders stepping up to the other challenge and saying, I can erase that piece. And we're seeing more and more people do that. One of the things I have to tell you in Arkansas that's always been a concern for me is in your funding formula for K12 education, there's $225 per student per year allotted for technology. Did you know that? In the funding formula for the state of Arkansas, there's over $200 allotted for the funding of technology into schools per student per year in the funding formula. Once the funding hits the school, it's the school's decision of what they do with the money. So there's a recognition that it's there. That's why I say fundamentally it's a leadership issue. And there's a few districts in Arkansas that are actually doing really great things. There's a few that aren't. And I know I'm out of time.
No, we can take a few other questions.
You sure?
I'm sure.
Okay.
Access to the technology. Senator brought up the point yesterday where those areas that are in dead zones. Technology, but no Wi-Fi, no internet, then what do you do?
Yeah, and another great question. One of the things, the first bullet that's up there, a global repository and distribution for digital content. One of the things that we've done at Apple is we've created this thing called iTunes U. And we've opened it up. We now have over 1,000 institutions of higher education, libraries, museums, public television stations, the state of Arkansas has an iTunes U site. That are now publishing content into that environment. Videos, audios, PDF files, and the like. The reason I say that is what's happening is students then, on devices like these, are downloading the chapters that they need, the videos that they need, all of the things that they need to take home with them, so that being connected isn't the detriment. But yes, and even in the sites we've seen do this has been a problem we've seen all over the country for many years now. So people put hotspots up in the local community centers, in the churches, in the community. That's another real popular one. The school will figure out a way to get a wireless router there, and all of a sudden the church is a hotspot for students to go to. But the bigger issue has been people are just archiving web pages. If I know you're going to need 3 or 4 web pages for what I want you to be able to do for the next day, they do it that way. I wish I could have played the example from Woodland Park, because they actually said, we know all the students don't have devices, so they burn them onto DVDs. All the lectures are burned on a DVD, or burned onto a VHS tape. They found a way to cut through all of that so that they're saying, I don't have to be online for all of this. It's good when I need to be at school. I'll tell you the biggest problem is broadband to schools. That needs to ratchet it up. So there are some schools that, because of the connectivity that they have in the schools, there's some schools that I'd actually call dead zones, because they're just don't have enough bandwidth to really bring the kind of video and visual elements and interactive elements that you'd like to have in those schools. That's a big issue. I know the federal government's looking at that big issue. Good questions, excellent questions. One more? Yes? I wish I had another hour. Seriously. Seriously. What are we doing? We have just created 2 things. One called iBook or iTunes Course Author, to allow individuals to author courses and publish them into iTunes. The one you're referring to most, that coincides most with what you're referring to, is we actually introduced another piece of software called iBooks Author. And we now have the 3 major K12 publishers. Higher ed's coming. We have the 3 major K12 publishers: Pearson, Houghton Mifflin McGraw-Hill, and Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and then McGraw-Hill. Those 3 major publishers. They control over 90% of the U.S. K12 education textbook market. Those 3. They are now releasing books, interactive books, iBooks, for high school. That's their starting point for this endeavor, is they're doing that. So that's happening. That absolutely is happening. There's, I think, 15 of them already up on the iBooks textbook store. They're $14.99 a book. Book belongs to the individual, though, not the school. The book is tied to the person, not to the institution. Okay? Just from an economics perspective, that's the way the publishers want to do it. What is about to happen in a huge way in that same context is that open source materials are about to explode. And so from 15 books from the 3 major publishers, I would venture to say within a matter of months, there will be several hundred free textbooks created by universities such as this, created by foundations from around the world, that will be online and available for students. We're not creating them. What we're doing is creating the richest, most robust tools to help individuals do that themselves. Simple enough that every week now, TJ, grandson, and Elizabeth, granddaughter, get a book from me that I write. I let them pick the next topic. We've done tractors. We've done clowns. We've done heavy-duty trucks. And every week I create a new book for them, because the tools are easy enough for me to write books for my grandkids, interactive books for my grandkids. So from Apple's perspective, that's what we're doing. We're trying to empower everyone in this room to have access to tools. By the way, iBooks Author, free. Runs on a Mac, but it's free. That's it. Yep. Thank you.
Give him another round of applause, please. Dr. Burnett?
Yes.
On behalf of the Mary E. Benjamin Educational Access Conference, it is my pleasure to present to you a token of our appreciation. If you would look at it from time to time and remember the University of Arkansas at Pine Bluff.